Hello, hello, testing, testing 1 2 3. Yep, going. Uh,
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay. Did you check if that was open? If it's not open, because the front doors weren't open, is ask Kiana. Do you know who? Okay. 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 Good. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of Scenes at 20. I'm just going to make a quick announcement, which is that the first panel ends at 11:30, and then we resume at 1:30. So you have 2-hour break for lunch. And it is my pleasure this morning to introduce the welcoming remarks. And it is graciously given by our Dean, Michelle Stevens, Dean of Humanities. Michelle Stevens is a professor of English and Latino and Caribbean Studies and Dean of Humanities in the School of Arts and Sciences. She became Dean this summer. She is the author of Black Empire, the Masculine Global Imaginary of Caribbean Intellectuals in the United States, 1914 to 1962, published by Duke University Press in 2005. And also Skin Acts, Race, Psychoanalysis, and the Black Male Performer, published also by Duke University Press, 2014. In this book, she uses both psychoanalysis and the study of race as a discourse to analyze select performances of 4 20th century Black actors and singers. She also co-edited a special issue of the Radical History Review, which is called Reconceptualizations of the African Diaspora, and is editor of a new collection on archipelagic American Studies, Decontinentalizing the Study of American Culture with Brian Russell Roberts, recently published in June 2017. She is a member of the editorial collective of the Radical History Review, the editorial advisory board of Rowman and Littlefield's Rethinking the Island book series, and she is series co-editor of Rutgers University Press's Critical Caribbean Studies book series. Please help me in welcoming Dean Stevens.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? That works. Thank you, Marissa, for that lovely introduction. It's such a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with you this morning. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be here yesterday. Please, welcome back to the second day of our symposium, Scenes at 20, Inspirations, Riffs, and Reverberations. And I'm just going to offer some brief opening and welcoming remarks to start us off, kind of get our thinking going as we start the day. So as you all know, we are here to honor and reflect on the continuing impact of Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th-Century America. I'd like to begin by taking us back to the afternoon of Wednesday, November 9th, 2016, the day after the presidential election. So needless to say, it was a strange and surreal day, and I had already seen some strange sights by the afternoon. On the streets that morning in New York City, I had seen a Black man with dreads and a Jewish Orthodox man in a kippah laughing and cheering as they read the newspaper headline in front of a deli and on the subway to Penn Station. I arrived on campus amidst shell-shocked faculty, both frightened and exultant students, and staff walking very carefully around each other as they tried to suss out each other's responses to the events of the night before. That evening, I found myself at a celebration reminiscent of this one, our recognition of a different book than the one we're here to engage each other about today. One of the Scenes at 20 symposium organizers, Marissa Fuentes, who was just up here, had just published Dispossessed Lives, Enslaved Women, Violence, and the Archive. Dispossessed Lives is a work, for those of you who probably know and who don't know, I'm sure everybody, that person isn't here, but Dispossessed Lives is a work studying the lives of enslaved women in 18th century Bridgetown, Barbados, and interrogating the archive to challenge the methods and categories by which historians have analyzed slavery in the Atlantic world. Now, as we gathered for that event, I remember empathizing with Marissa as she stood up at the podium to speak, thinking there was nothing she could do or say that would lift the spirits of or clear the fog of confusion blanketing everyone in the room. Marissa paused, looked out at the audience, and said something like, I may not be remembering her exact words, "We have been here before." Now, I think she may have even repeated it. And I don't know about anyone else there that day, but chills ran up and down my spine and goosebumps appeared on my forearms as she oh so succinctly pulled us out of the hysteria and fantasy that may have shaped our inhabiting of the historical present in the days leading up to the election and reminded us of the long view. She may not have quite lifted my spirits, but she did clear a bit my confusion. And far from making me feel despair, she actually helped me re-engage my ability to feel hope. We had been, certainly, as Black Americans and Blacks across the Americas, in as trying, confused, and most importantly, contradictory times before. I'm sorry to borrow so directly from Marissa in order to lend the necessary gravitas to our proceedings this weekend, but no better moment captures for me the significance of the intervention Saidiya Hartman made when she published Scenes of Subjection, illuminating how forms of terror and resistance have shaped, even provided the very contours within which modern Black identities have been forged. Her work forced us to wrestle with the contradictory inheritances of slavery, the peculiar institution, the largest one of which being the instability of the meaning of freedom. Actually, a number of everyday meanings were upended with scenes. One found oneself questioning not just what is freedom, but also what is Black suffering, for whom are scenes of Black suffering directed, or what are the bonds of affection made possible between the formerly enslaved and their descendants and those in positions of mastery and their descendants? How could those forms of attachment not be simultaneously fraught with a heightened anxiety and interpersonal terror that comes under conditions of subjugation? Tavia, that's my psychoanalytic Scenes of Subjection that you set me up for. But how to be free? Hasn't this continued to be the question in our hot historical moment, when all political meanings and behaviors are suddenly shifting under our feet every day, both during Obama's presidency and now during Trump's? What kind of moment are we in? At such times when that question presses in upon us, we need anchors to help us pause, ground ourselves, and find a position from which to rethink the present moment and its shaping by the past, and then move forward. Scenes of Subjection is just such an anchor, but not because it offers us eternal truths. Rather, it anchors us in a series of debates about how we may use both pessimism and hope to blind ourselves to the parameters shaping our reality, thereby circumscribing our ability to see different options for the future. The legacy of Scenes of Subjection is its prescience in articulating the questions we will be asking and returning to when we need to both check ourselves and check in with ourselves over multiple generations, remembering precisely that we are still in a conjuncture shaped by slavery. That is, we have very much been here before. I'm honored to be a part of this discussion and so pleased to play my part in my new role to help host and welcome many friends, old and new, to our campus. I'd like to thank my colleagues, the symposium organizers, Carter Mathis, Associate Professor and Associate Director of the Undergraduate Program in English, and the Director of the Rutgers Advanced Institute in Critical Caribbean Studies, Marissa Fuentes, Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies and History and Presidential Term Chair in African American History, along with Maisha Priest, Associate Professor of the Gallatin School at NYU, and Lisa Zay Winters, Associate Professor of African American Studies and English at Wayne State University, all of whom had the foresight and vision to bring us here on this occasion. Welcome.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay. It's so wonderful to see you on this beautiful Saturday morning. I'm Lisa Zay Winters, one of the co-organizers of the panel. This morning's panel's organizing theme is the tenses of freedom, and it specifically scenes meditative and incisive concerns with the unfinished project of freedom. Some of the questions guiding us in organizing the panel included considering what's at stake in grappling with the concept of freedom in our present and possibilities of the future. How do we rethink or rename this term in the context of Black imaginings or definitions of freedom in concert with or in tension with Western constructions of freedom? Each of the scholars on this morning's panel have in their own work explored the concept of freedom in relation to how Black people negotiate tenses of freedom within systems of slavery or in post-emancipation societies, the tactics they used and those used against them in the struggle to wrest free of racial denigrations and the constrictions and confinements put in place by white supremacy and its structures, technologies, and discourses of power. I'll introduce the panelists and our moderator in the order they are seated at the table from your left to right. Herman Bennett is a renowned scholar on the history of the African diaspora with a particular focus on Latin American history.
Hey.
Did I say something wrong?
No.
Oh. Okay. I was like, what did I do? Okay, his books include Colonial Blackness, A History of Afro-Mexico, and Africans in Colonial Mexico, Absolutism, Christianity, and Afro-Creole Consciousness, 1570 to 1640, in which he offers a social historical examination of free Afro-Mexican kinship practices in the mature and late colonial periods. Dr. Bennett has received fellowships from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Council of Learned Societies. He has lectured widely in Europe and the Americas and comes to the Graduate Center from Rutgers University after starting his scholarly career at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Bennett holds a PhD in Latin American history from Duke University, where he was a Mellon Scholar of the Humanities. Simone Brown is Associate Professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She teaches and researches surveillance studies, digital media, and Black diaspora studies. Her first book, Dark Matters, on the Surveillance of Blackness, examines surveillance with a focus on transatlantic slavery, biometric technologies, branding, airports, and creative texts, and has won several awards, including the Donald McGannon Award for Social and Ethical Relevance in Communications Technology Research, the Surveillance Studies Network Book Prize, and the Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize presented by the American Studies Association. Dr. Brown is an executive board member of HasTag, and she's also a member of Deep Lab, a feminist collaborative composed of artists, engineers, hackers, writers, and theorists. Sarah Haley is an associate professor of gender studies and African American studies at UCLA, received her BA in political science from Vassar College. Her research interests include prison studies, 19th and 20th century African American history, women's and gender history, labor studies, Black feminism, and feminist theories of violence. Her book, No Mercy Here, Gender, Punishment, and the Making of Jim Crow Modernity, won the 2016 National Women's Studies Association Sarah A. Whaley Prize for the best book in any field on women and labor from an intersectional perspective, and also the Association of Black Women Historians 2016 Letitia Woods Brown Book Award. Our moderator, Evie Shockley, is an associate professor of English at Rutgers University and the creative editor for Feminist Studies. Dr. Shockley is the author of several poetry collections, including The New Black, winner of the Hurston Wright Legacy Award in Poetry, and the forthcoming Semi-Automatic. She has also published a critical study, Renegade Poetics, Black Aesthetics and Formal Innovation in African American Poetry. Her honors include the Stephen Henderson Award and the Holmes National Poetry Prize. Please join me in welcoming this panel.
I'm assuming I'm going to go first based on the lineup, right? Can everyone hear me? Good morning, everybody. I just want to remind you to get out your copies of the book because there are going to be some close readings of the text. Whew, could not refuse. It's good to be here, and it's also good to be here with an inspired dean running the humanities. So I just wanted to say that. It's not a small thing, and to actually have someone sort of situate an introduction in the way that you did is what we need among our administrators in the academy today. So thank you very much. It's humbling to be here, and I just want to thank the organizers, Maisha and Lisa and Carter and Marisa. It's just amazing what you guys have done, and I understand that this is a labor of love and an engagement, a political engagement as well. But it's just remarkable, and I'm humbled and honored to be here, and I'm just also thankful to be able to be in a room with and to think with you folks, right? Obviously, there are lots of different conversations going on around in the academy and around the work that we do, but it's not a small feat to be in a room with our interlocutors. This happens too rarely, and so we owe you a tremendous debt. Thank you. All right, and obviously Saidiya, but you're gonna hear the debt here. I will say though, Soiled Gods will be out in September, and I brought it back precisely because you insisted on it coming back as a title for this next book. So that's there, and it's totally, in some ways, a conversation with you, among others. Okay. An introduction. Let me begin with several observations, and I'll keep a pretty tight lid on my time. It's like I'm gonna, a little Germanic thing, As an introduction, let me begin with several observations. Can you hear me? Beginning in the 1550s, but especially by 1570, ethnic Africans outnumbered the Spanish population in many of the principal cities of Spanish America, most notably in the epicenters of Spanish power, Mexico City and Lima. At the height of Mexico's slave trade in the first decades of the 17th century, which forcibly introduced over 200,000 peoples of African descent, a sizable free black population emerged, representing the largest such population in the Americas. 150 years later, upon receiving the summaries of the 1793 Revelledo census, the Council of Ministers in Madrid was probably surprised to learn that there were 375,000 people of African descent in New Spain or Mexico. Although the ministers had sanctioned the slave trade to New Spain, formulated colonial policies, crafted the laws for the colony, and adjudicated over its legal matters, most of the ministers had never set foot in the viceroyalty. The ministers' familiarity with New Spain and its peoples was largely informed by official correspondence, individual petitions, travel accounts, and the impressionistic Costa paintings that had become fashionable in the late 18th century. Although ministers recognized the major contributions of these African descendants to the royal coffers, they were unaware of the size and significance of the Black presence. The Spaniards on the spot, however, did not share the Council of Ministers' ignorance. They revealed their awareness of the descendants of Africans in their voluminous correspondence through promulgation of local laws and by their social attitudes. As Spaniards, moreover, their behavior suggests they were mindful of the descendants of Africans. Despite this familiarity, Spaniards in New Spain could not appreciate the uniqueness and diversity of the ever-expanding Afro-Mexican population. Royal officials calculated that its size more than doubled from 290,000 in 1742 to 650,000 in 1810. These figures, impressive in isolation, are truly remarkable when noting that the Black population was overwhelmingly free. In fact, throughout the 18th century, New Spain, or Mexico, had the largest free Black population in the Western Hemisphere. That is, before the ascendance of liberalism, the largest free Black population in the Americas had already come into existence. But rather than ask what happened to Mexico's Black population, a standard refrain from scholars and non-scholars alike, we should imagine the form of their histories and to seek to untangle this presence and its archives from the nationalist fictions that render the Black experience invisible beyond the grand narrative of slavery. This is how I wrote and thought in the early 90s as a flat-footed social historian, intent on recovery and inscription. Having uncovered an archive in the hostile nationalist landscape that disavowed any inquiry into Blackness. Soon thereafter, I had the fortune of having one of my favorite historians and friend, Tara Hunter, introduce me to Saidiya Hartman at the 1994 AHA in San Francisco, who, in her characteristic way, who queried me and all around her about their work, which quickly moved to questioning the possibilities of producing positive histories of slavery and freedom. We found common ground or common interest in Hayden White, which was also a shorthand for our respective interest in critical theory. I wrote but never published my dissertation, though I utilized some of the archival findings in 2 of my subsequent books. But that specific conversation with Saidiya and 3 other sustained encounters, one at Berkeley, where Saidiya invited me to be in conversation with Fred Moten, David Scott, and Colin Dayan, a 2-day conference at USC on slavery, and an invitation to the year-long seminar on redress that Saidiya and Stephen Best convened at UC's Irvine's Humanities Institute, along with the shifting landscape of critical theory, left me unable to be the social historian of old. Eventually, I emerged from what can only be described as a profound impasse that I even today render meaningful through what I wrote in the preface of Colonial Blackness, A History of Afro-Mexico. I'm not going to go there. Scenes of subjection, simply put, engendered a transformation. The question wasn't one of evidence. For example, my interest in the relationship between violence and power, a specific response to Saidiya's insistence that slavery needs to be seen as a site of theorization of power, is but a recognition that so little of our thinking and theorization of the Afro-European encounter, the slave trade, slavery, the short history of freedom, and contemporary crisis in which Blackness remains ensnared, rarely presses beyond the tropes of terror, brutality, horror, injustice, exploitation, and oppression. Words. Simply words. A shorthand, but far from a developed theory or a developed thinking or theory. Stated differently, early modern or early American studies, and for that matter, all of its related fields were and are still desperately in need of theorization of power and its techniques, including violence before and even after scenes of subjection. That's the work that Saidiya made us do, right? Is asking us not just to sort of think about the spectral presence, but also to actually think about what those words mean when we invoke questions like terror, exploitation, oppression, etc. What do I mean concretely? A body not covered, a death not respected, humanity not acknowledged. Here I am, of course, thinking of Michael Brown's prostrate body lying for hours in the street of downtown Ferguson. We don't have to be readers of the Antigone or the Iliad to know that honoring and respecting the dead represents a sacred tradition. Achilles dragging the naked body of Hector before the gates of Troy was an outrage to all, Trojans and Greeks and even the gods. My point here is not simply to draw attention to the symbolism of power. The symbolic is also an enactment of power, but that even in our secular age plays a considerable role in the history of difference. We can only imagine the legacy of Mike Brown's death, but the memory of his abject black body has a life as well. It tells us that even in death, black lives don't matter. But it also points to the afterlife of slavery that does not need to be named liberalism when in relationship to the black experience. Liberalism still remains the reigning technique of power. And I'm going to come back to that, right? Because I think that there's a little bit of slippage for us here. And I think that Saidiya's work is actually trying to remind us that we don't need liberalism for the kind of work that it's doing when our analysis of liberalism hasn't yet been exceeded. And I want to come back to that in the larger part. For 20 years, Saidiya has been pressing us and demanding a more active engagement with slavery and its afterlife, freedom and what it means beyond our shorthand of terror, brutality, and horror. But in asking if violence might have a history, I'm also registering my concern that in the long and desperate histories of slavery and freedom that come to configure our modernity, our approach to the subject, the abject black body, is and remains conscripted to a liberal subject. The history of liberalism, its promise and its exclusions, is in fact the theoretical subject of Scenes of Subjection, but it also the source of Saidiya's theoretical critique and criticism. In this, she challenges us to press beyond liberal teleology, which Saidiya gently reminds us that even some of the most prominent critics of the black radical tradition reproduce. Here, of course, I am thinking about Orlando Patterson, and how much of his magisterial work is still formulated around the individual subject, despite claiming to delineate a process of making, how the slave was made or engendered. The story Patterson tells already assumes the individual subject on whom the violence can be enacted. In this respect, Slavery and Social Death, despite its chapters on enslavement, alienation, etc., begins from a post-Enlightenment subject, the individual. For instance, the master-slave dialectic is that of an Enlightenment subjectivity, the being conceiving of himself, his tyranny, and freedom on terms that always already assumes a form of subjectivity rooted in the temporality of the modern and that which is associated with the Enlightenment. This is surprising, which I'm only now realizing thanks to Saidiya's work, given that Patterson is also the scholar who makes the claim that we need to historicize the concept of freedom, that to see freedom as having a history, a temporality that comes into being as an anathema, he insists in the non-Western, i.e. pre-modern world societies, because to be free means that one was a detached being, a subject who could not make claims on others, therefore existed in a state of limbo or social death. Despite these concerns about Patterson's brilliant formulation, the larger issue is why haven't we done more to think about the history of violence and in relationship to defining African and Black experiences across time and space, and before both the emergence and the ascendance of liberal subjectivities. This is indeed what Saidiya, through Scenes of Subjections, has been asking us to do for 20 years. In conclusion, allow me to attend to the provocation that is framed by the title of this session, The Tenses of Freedom. Obviously, in relationship to Mexico's free black population, but also the population in Spanish America before the second slavery, we must invoke the preterite, a completed past in relationship to an emerging nationalism and the project of liberalism. Stated differently, much has been written about freedom, but this work has tended to privilege Enlightenment thought and its intended focus on the possessive individual, commercialization, and the contract. One of Saidiya's principal interventions is to situate this telos in relationship to the enslaved and the free. But freedom, like slavery, has a genealogy that precedes and exceeds the Enlightenment and its ascendant's consumer society and bourgeois subjectivity. Emerging in the wasteland of imperial expansion, the peculiar incarnations of early modern freedom anticipated the discrete forms of liberty manifest in Enlightenment centers and the subsequent hubs of bourgeois democracy. The focus on earlier incarnations of freedom and their locale directs our attention to neglected histories that simply did not disappear simply as the abstraction Enlightenment emerged as ascendant. But in many ways, they were ongoing and yet also completed. In Scenes of Subjection, Saidiya insists that we approach freedom through the weight of the slave past. I couldn't agree more, but interestingly enough, beyond Cuba and Brazil, that has never been the case in our analysis, in our work, in our scholarship. Simply put, tackling the black past, the framing of the African diaspora, is not synonymous with an engagement with the story of slavery. Hay negros aquí, along with estuvieron negros aquí, points to the spectral presence, but not an understanding of the nature of slavery. Seeing black bodies and thinking about the conditions and the nature of their slave experience are not synonymous. And in lieu of this understanding, which Saidiya insists comes to burden the meaning and framing of freedom, we can merely speculate, marvel, and point, but not yet theorize in relationship to a free black population and the nature of their full enactment, their fully enacted freedom before an ascendant liberalism. Scenes of Subjection at 20 reminds us how much lifting is still required for basic questions and answers to be raised in relationship to the black condition. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. Okay. So last year it was announced by the government of Nova Scotia, so that's a province in Canada. It was announced by that province that the Book of Negroes was added to its open data portal. The Book of Negroes can now be downloaded by researchers as a static CSV file, where the data can then be filtered, queried, and aggregated. And developers now have access to this ledger as an API, and then use popular computer programming language like Python or JavaScript to build new applications out of this 18th century handwritten ledger that lists the 3,000 self-emancipating ex-slaves who embarked on mainly British ships during the British evacuation of New York in 1783, after the War of Independence. The Book of Negroes is the first government-issued document for state-regulated migration between the U.S. and Canada that explicitly linked corporal markers of the black people's body, to the right to travel. Situating this ledger of black escape in this way, for me, forms an important corrective to the history of the modern passport as intimately tied to the surveillance of black people and therefore not held in some type of artificial separation. With this ledger, now a downloadable data set, gone is the description column from that ledger that indexes the over 3,000 self-emancipating black people in that death by shorthand type of way that Saidiya Hartman warns us about when it comes to ledgers. Gendered nouns such as wench, fellow, lad, and girl, adjectives like fine, stout, lusty, sickly, good-looking, idiot, worn out, feeble, or just ordinary, or ditto, ditto, ditto. Their names like Suki, Thomas Brown, Pussy, Fortune, and Child of Dinah are listed on the Excel spreadsheet in column F for names. Just names, no longer Negroes' names, as in the handwritten original. This revised data set renders the Negro in Negroes' names as no more, unremarkable, now evacuated in that familiar type of way that reflects a deep investment by the Canadian state, now and before, to empty itself out of blackness. Like the demolition of Africville in the 1960s, a black settlement marked for urban renewal, to the upcoming renaming of various sites in and around Quebec, like Lac de Negre and Nigger Rapids, so named because 2 black people were drowned there in the early 1900s. All evidence of black life in Canada. Also missing from this data set is the column for remarks, where crude annotations were made. Some serve as biometric identifiers, such as scar on the forehead, small scar on her nose. Some mark these people's own claims as autonomous subjects, such as formerly slave of, says she was born free, and a likely rascal that said he was his own property. And some of these describe a changing saying, came from Jamaica, can't understand him. I still find that one quite funny. Gone too from the Book of Negroes as this revised data set is the column that lists the so-called claimants, if any, as a caveat was set out in the 7th provisional article in the 1783 Treaty of Paris, that no property could be departed with. Not all escaped from New York on those ships. Some were pulled off of those very ships and had to come to testify unsuccessfully at Francis Tavern, a bar turned courtroom where you hoped, it wasn't like Cheers, you didn't want anybody to know your name because people were using aliases and other means to get on those ships. That was a joke, I guess. Cheers. This bar turned courtroom, they argued for their right to leave New York City as free people. And instead were delivered to their claimants to be disposed of as he may think proper, and put on a de facto no-sale list. In the section Idle Concerns in Scenes of Subjection, Hartman asked, how does one narrate a story of freedom when confronted with the discrepant legacy of emancipation and the decidedly circumscribed avenues available to the freed? That is the task of researching the Book of Negroes. Black people, who would later be called Black loyalists by many or escaped property by others, who, as part of a stipulation with the Treaty of Paris, would eventually be evacuated on ships with, like the vessels, Generous Friends, Providence, and Venus, from what would become the United States to find themselves in pre-Confederation Canada in ports like Halifax and Quebec. Some arrived as indentured laborers to white loyalists. Others on those ships arrived under continued conditions of slavery to white loyalists. They would find in Canada other enslaved Black people, other Black loyalists who arrived from Boston in 1777, and largely unworkable land. Many labored on public works projects, fared slave catchers, and faced possible recapture, and other forms of forced or coerced labor. As Black Canadian poet Sylvia Hamilton put it about Tracadie, New Brunswick, this land does not forgive. We cut our way, entangle forests, backs ache, hands, feet bruised, bodies broken. This scene, as Hartman puts it regarding Black life but south of the border, is an anomalous condition betwixt and between slavery and freedom. Post-emancipation Black life in Canada, as elsewhere, was and is contingent, an unfinished emancipation. The making of the Book of Negroes into quote-unquote big data comes with a silencing, missing columns, a column emptied out of Negroes' names. Now I have to contend with this new coding of the Book of Negroes, a coding that on the surface seems to make little room for Black life in a way. But I question if this archive is truly silenced by this revising, by this digitizing of the ledger. A question that I think continues to shape my work is what is lost and what could be made possible when Black life is made digital? I'll just repeat that for the panel as like the slow ball question that you can ask me. What is lost and what can be made possible when Black life is made digital? When I first touched the Book of Negroes in a room in Kew Gardens that, as Hazel Carby told us yesterday, purports transparency, one made, she said, for all who have the time to sit and stare. I had to put on white gloves, lock up my stuff except for a camera, pencil, and my laptop. So this is the security theater of the archive. So perhaps new imaginings, ones that are more accessible, will come out of the Book of Negroes API, like that of the Transatlantic Slave Trade Voyage Database. Perhaps. I will leave that for the programmers. I owe a debt to Saidiya Hartman and her methods for offering me and laying out a way of troubling surveillance and disrupting its methodologies. From Saidiya's lessons on how to use documents for what she calls contrary purposes, to just straight up following her archive and the sites of analysis that she traces to ask of them questions of my own. Wilson Chin, a branded slave from Louisiana, the Catherine Market Breakdown, how to read the violences that litter the diaries of Thomas Thistlewood, that slaver in Jamaica who in the 18th century would record his various predatory sexual assaults by marking what became to me as I read that document a dreaded XXX formation in a triangle. And the pain he imposed on Cuba by way of his iron brand, recorded again as a TT in an inverted triangle in the margins. Those markings in the margins are the 18th century infographics of violence. This is, as Hartman puts it, the history that hurts. And she says, the still unfolding narrative of captivity, dispossession, and domination that engenders the Black subject in the Americas, she wrote. The brand, the ledger, the laws, her questioning of the genealogy of Bentham's panopticon, warning me that, as she states in Scenes of Subjection, the carceral is a caricature of the plantation. This is to say that Black studies in general, and Saidiya Hartman in particular, have always been doing the work of surveillance studies. And I thank her for doing the heavy lifting in scenes of subjection. It's an honor to be here. Thank you all.
Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay. I just want to join in the thanks to Marisa and Carter and Lisa and Maisha for your extraordinary work to organize this important event. I'm very happy to be here. So I really am so immensely grateful to Saidiya for her kindness and, of course, for her work. And I really couldn't possibly convey the impact that it has had on me and my work. And so my comments today are going to be a little bit episodic. In considering the afterlife of slavery as a gendered regime, I paused on the section of scenes of subjection that Hartman titles The Will and the Whip. Freedom did not abolish the lash, she explains. Instead, what occurred was the displacement of the whip by the cultivation of conscience, the repressive instrumentality of the law, coercive forms of labor management, and orchestrated and spontaneous violence aimed at restoring relations of mastery. End quote. The whip was placed in Black women's hands, metaphorically, as a necessary condition for Black subjection. More than 3 decades after emancipation in 1900, Martha Vines's will was rendered through the object of the whip. Vines appeared as a defendant in Atlanta Municipal Court, and the discourse surrounding her case focused on her mothering, or her position as anathema to mothering. She was accused of beating and starving her children, and her alleged maternal iniquity became the subject of 2 original nursery rhymes. One was delivered by the judge at her sentencing, and the other appeared in the pages of the Atlanta Constitution alongside an illustration of Vines whipping her children, a daughter in the foreground receiving the brunt of the violence. First, the judge's version of the rhyme. Here was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children she didn't know what to do. She gave them some broth without any bread, then whipped them all soundly and put them to bed. The whip displaced through projection. By force of alchemy, judges invoked both will and whip in the moment of liberal juridical encounter, wresting it from the hands of slaveholders and attaching it firmly to Black women who, now free, were culpable for the brutality of the lash. The law produced Black women as bearers of the whip. The whip became a marker of will and criminal culpability, intensifying the repressive instrumentality of the law. Inspired by the judge, the Atlanta Constitution reporter who covered the case riffed his own rendition of the nursery rhyme. There was an old woman who lived in a stew and cussed her young brats till she made the air blue. She was so very wroth, and they so badly bred, that fussy old woman to the chain gang was led. Those who transposed the whip transposed the weather. As Christina Sharp tells us, anti-Blackness is pervasive as climate. It is the atmospheric condition of time and place. It produces new ecologies. Here, brutality was depicted as emerging so thick from the Black female body that it altered environment, making it blue, and blue in this rendition was toxic. It is no wonder the judge mused that at least one of her children was already serving time in a convict camp. As many scholars here today, including Saidiya Hartman, have revealed, Black women's wombs were the bellies of worlds of economic development. And this was no less true for the late 19th century, in which Black women's deviance was the gestational apparatus of carceral economic development. The household was a unit of reproduction, a metaphorical womb in which criminality was understood to be cultivated, and from which prison laborers could then be extracted. The Black female body and Black will were deployed to naturalize Black criminality. As the head of the Georgia prison system reasoned in 1875, without the influence of mothers who could teach the values of docility, the state would need to invest in a number of prison islands. For, he reasoned, the time is not so distant when these young vagrants will get out of their long shirts and into Georgia stripes. Scenes lays out the, quote, elaborate micropenality of everyday life. In Atlanta at the turn of the 20th century, Black women and girls were routinely sent to convict lease camps where they broke rocks to fill city streets for things like allegedly cursing in the presence of white women, things like stealing everyday items from their employers, things like quarreling or throwing dirty water in the street. The liberal narrative was crucial. In her foundational 1901 book, Experimental Sociology, sociologist and progressive reformer Frances Keller recounted her observation of a Black woman who dwelled in a, quote, cell of infanticide. The unnamed woman had been convicted of killing her child and was now, according to Keller, holed up in a prison cell, refusing any social contact. When she was not working, she spent her time making and playing with baby dolls in her cell. An illustration of the woman was reproduced in the Chicago Tribune in 1900. The future of gendered racial capitalism required that Black maternal social life be rendered a thing of fantasy and existing only in the space of captivity. The gendered afterlife of slavery is characterized by the continued unfolding of partus sequitur ventrum, and what Stephanie Smallwood, Jennifer Morgan, and Christina Sharp discussed yesterday as the disfiguring of Black maternity. The condition of criminal followed that of the mother, culpability brought forth from the womb of Black women. The process of disfigurement was socially reproductive work that produced racialized gender as use value in the legitimization of Black captivity and the extraction of prison labor. As so eloquently elaborated in yesterday's opening panel, the womb continued to be a site of production of value in both commodity and disposable life. Those whose criminalization was justified by the deviance of Black mothers would be forced to extract iron and lay railroad track in convict camps where they would be whipped and often die prematurely under the weight of disease proliferated in carceral dungeons. We were asked to think about the tenses of freedom today. In Lose Your Mother, Hartman writes, quote, if slavery feels proximate rather than remote, and freedom seems increasingly elusive, this has everything to do with our own dark times. If the ghost of slavery still haunts our present, Hartman writes, it is because we are still looking for an exit from the prison. I'm interested in this statement's complex temporality. Slavery's reconfiguration or refiguration is clearly positioned in the present, but tethered to the devastating indictment of slavery's afterlife is desire, constituted by the search for an exit. Desire and search operate in the present continuous tense as ongoing, a necessary foundation for practice. If part of the work of Scenes was to demonstrate how ideas and acts we thought were antidotes to the problem of subjection are in fact reconfigurations of the problem, the character of practice surfaces as a space in which white supremacist ideology is contested and Black social life happens. Practice necessitates contesting respectability, objectification, and the enclosures of liberal discourse and politics. Scenes of Subjection and Lose Your Mother provide the specific grammars and radical genres through which to consider the chameleonic character of both violent encumbrance and possibility constituted in the nexus of care and refusal. Some of the daughters of Black mothers who circulated as toxic symbols of Black incorrigibility looked for an exit from the prison at the turn of the century in ways that perhaps reflect what Hartman calls the space of struggle and the non-autonomy of practice. Actually, only fragments of the lives of 3 such daughters remain. They were Hattie, a home nurse, age 11, Carrie, a laundress, age 16, and Gladys, occupation unknown, age 12. The extant archival documents reveal only the end of a story, the moment in which they were apprehended for destroying the edifices of homes belonging to white residents of Albany, Georgia in 1918. The young girls stole flowers and tore up flower pots that lined the large, pristine white homes, and they threw rocks in the windows. In so doing, they gave voice to the gendered infrastructure of white supremacy, in which domestic space was the nucleus of the Jim Crow economy and culture, and a site of terrorization and confinement for Black women and girls. We can see in this moment refusals of innocence and individuated responsibility, refusals of obligation, and the savagery of liberalism. To the judges who convicted them, their behavior could only have stemmed from what they called a case of racial antipathy. Like Martha Vines, to the chain gang they were led. After attempting to build a Black girl commons with bare hands and rocks and stolen flowers, they also collectively refused captivity that would be the punishment for such criminal behavior. Once in prison, they sought an exit. They dug through the dirt that held the bars of the Albany stockade, until they could loosen those bars enough to create a hole just big enough to wiggle their way through. They were caught before they could succeed. The extant archival documents reveal only the end of a story. We are left with questions provoked by the conversations between the work of Saidiya Hartman, Tara Hunter, and Thavolia Glimpf. From Hartman, where does the impossible domestic fit into the general strike? What is the text of her insurgency and the genre of her refusal? What visions for the future would encourage her to run or propel her to flight? I continue to wonder about the intimate engagements and political visions that led the three girls to wander with such deliberateness. I wonder what the criminalized girls, impossible domestics, and longtime neighbors shared in the moment before their daring act of rebellion. What consumed the days and months of conversation, complaints, collaboration, closeness, and camaraderie that led to the destruction of Jim Crow's domestic architecture? What in the fragments of such an archive are we able to know about the resources that the afterlife of fury, the afterlife of audacity, the afterlife of unfashioned obligation demand? The evidence of things not written. The violence of the archive is an unredressable theft of Black feminist practice, of the intricacies of Black feminist political life that constitute Black radicalism or the unrelenting search for an exit. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for these, rich, productive, amazing remarks. I am, like person after person has said yesterday and today, so honored to be here to participate in this celebration of Saidiya Hartman's path-breaking work. Very, very grateful to the organizers for making this space a project that we cannot really overestimate. It is a lot of work, and it is so important in the ways that Herman has already gestured to. Oh wow, I'm thinking about Saidiya's work that raises questions so illuminating that we are still conducting research by their light. Work that models approaches to the dilemmas that we confront in the project of Black study, that wed ethics to innovation. As we've heard, this panel was charged with, among other things, taking up Saidiya's concerns with the unfinished project of freedom, to consider together how we understand the transitions from legal slavery to emancipation and beyond, as well as how we understand the continued subjection of Black lives. We were asked to ponder these matters under the heading, The Tenses of Freedom, which I think I have discovered the organizers formulated, and very brilliantly so. This phrase invites us, as does Saidiya's work, to think about freedom not as a noun, a static thing that we can possess or a stable condition we can occupy, but as a verb, as action, pursuit, movement. Formally, tense refers to a set of forms taken by a verb to indicate the time and sometimes also the continuance or completeness of the verb's action in relation to the time of its utterance. Tense can be simple. I was enslaved. I am freed. I will be free. Or it can be perfect. I had been enslaved. I have been freed. I will have been free. Scenes of Subjection demands that we recognize that freedom, as a word uttered at the time of emancipation, had no simple future tense, and as a word uttered in this time of retrogression, has no perfect past tense. The demands of her work on us make us aware of, as well, the tenseness of freedom, our inability to relax, the state of tension that this complex, imperfect freedom entails, and which now seems to intensify. Sarah Haley's remarks, and I'm shifting the order because of the way I approached their work in advance of the panel, so forgive me. Sarah Haley's remarks point to the continuance of tense. In her words, a conception of freedom that is ongoing as desire, endeavor, and project. She provocatively suggests that the continuance of the rule of partus sequitur ventrum in the afterlife of slavery might take shape as daughters following their mothers in radical practices that seek an exit from the prisons that have been made for us and the prisons we have been taught to make for ourselves. As a question coming out of her remarks, I'm wondering if Sarah or anyone on the panel would speak to the degree to which our thinking about Saidiya's The Will and the Whip discussion might be brought to bear on the kinds of choices about parenting that the unmattering of Black lives in the eyes of the police and the white supremacist state generally force upon the mothers and fathers of Black children today. And my questions, of course, betray my sort of focus on the contemporary, but try to link back to the histories that we've been asked to think about. Simone Brown's remarks isolate a painful irony that the technologies of the time of freedom can intensify past unfreedom. In this future, I would say imperfect, the digitalized erasure of past violences is itself a form of violence, producing a downloadable anti-palimpsest whose cover-up can't be seen through its deceptive opacity, in which greater access cleanly papers over a decrease in data, a newly created silence in the archive. Now, you've suggested that the silence may not be as complete as my metaphor suggests, but I'd love to hear more about that. And also to ask, in a slant echo of the question that you put for the panel, in a moment where new technologies for perpetrating spectacular violence are occupying a lot of our energy, how might we also be thinking about ways that technological advances create new scenes of barely discernible terror, right? Herman Bennett's remarks take us to a moment before slavery, or before this particular form of chattel slavery, to think about what we might learn about freedom if we situate ourselves prior to the instantiation of the liberal subject. What I would like to pose, coming out of it, in a relation to his talk, at the very least, is a question of, in a sense, what the framing of this panel might suggest when thought of against the framing of the panel, the first panel of the program yesterday. We were looking then at the afterlives of slavery. We're asked this morning to talk about tenses of freedom. In relation to your chronology, what difference does it make if we frame the paradigm around slavery versus around freedom? Is that purely semantic, or does it push us in different directions for questions? So I will stop there and invite responses to any of that.
Thanks so much for those comments and questions, Evie. They're really provocative, and certainly the question that you raised is one that I think about all of the time in terms of what does this history mean for the contemporary of policing and the continued search for an exit from the prison. And I guess one of the things that inspires me about the story of the three girls is a kind of radical refusal of innocence as a liberal construction of how we think about Black value. And so one of the things that I didn't mention in this excerpt is that the parents and community members of the girls sort of beseech the court to say, please, they're young and innocent, and please just release them as a Christmas gift to us. And so there's a contest here about what it means, how one is to achieve freedom. And the response of the community is understandable, as is our response, I think, today, to say that all Black victims of police violence or carceral violence are innocent. But I wonder whether Saidiya's work and the practices of sort of a Black girl radicalism can complicate that for us. And we see the tenses and the tensions of this predicament in the present history of someone like Corinne Gaines, who I think refused, right, the category of innocence, and parented in a way that refuses the category of innocence as a resource for thinking about a more robust and complex future of freedom. And so I think that's the lesson that I sort of take from this, and also, of course, the lessons of scenes.
Thank you. So I think I'll answer the question that you posed, although I probably might not remember it too exactly, but I'll just go from here. I guess I borrow from Jessica Marie Johnson and her notion of digital blackness. So to say that, I kind of maybe threw you for a loop to say that maybe there's a possibility that could be liberatory or that could be pedagogical with, now that this archive is digital, that people can program it to do perhaps imagine in different things. And for her, this digital blackness is what, holding on to the way that slavery haunts, the archive of slavery haunts the digital, is a way of disrupting this kind of presumed neutrality of it. And so that there could be possibilities like the transatlantic slave-based database, or what would it mean to create a website that tracks these voyages, who was pulled off the ship and who wasn't, but that to remember and to hold fast to that these technologies aren't neutral, and that we have to consider the ways in which a presumed neutrality it can be troubled by the archive. And so I'll give you maybe an example from my experience going to Francis Tavern. I went there, I guess unannounced in a way. There's a kind of a joke. My dad was with me and he said, well, why don't you show them your business card from U of T and maybe they'll talk to you then? And I'm like, no, it's not going to work. But I did talk to the security guards. And so Sam Francis, known as Black Sam, Jamaican-born, one of the security guards told me that they continually are removing his pictures from the wall that might betray his blackness. And that he said, this is Black Wall Street here. And as I walked around, so this is the bar that I told you about that's kind of like Cheers, but you don't want anybody to know your name. So, what would happen at this bar is every Wednesday, people would come to argue for their freedom, mainly men, maybe mainly women who were pulled off ships, who had perhaps claimed an alias, a different identity, or that they came behind the British lines in time to be evacuated. And I couldn't find any kind of recognition or a space to understand where perhaps these arbitration hearings took place. So this is the idea of that being evacuated. And so, like, what could augmented reality do to that space to help us to understand and to situate those Black people who argued for their autonomy, who argued for their, in terms of self-making, for their freedom? That would be an interesting site for me. Yeah.
That's excellent. I really appreciate the question, and I think it's a tough question to address. But and I think that there's a way in which how I want to approach an answer would be to think about what Saidiya is asking us to do in scenes, but in all of her work, is to sort of think about the sort of, she's insisting on us thinking through questions of freedom in relationship to a kind of historicized understanding of slavery, right? And oftentimes, the word slavery, depending of what audience we're talking about, but not for this audience, but for most people who are thinking about the question of slavery, that's about like numbers, it's about like property, and what she's doing is sort of saying that that's just one aspect of it, right? And that there's the question of terror, and she's trying to be very clear about what that means at one level. And then she's also trying to think about it at the level of property. She's trying to think about it at the level of ownership and natal alienation, and putting all those things together in a way that I really don't think that most scholars working on slavery, perhaps out of this room, actually even attend to, right? It's a singular, it's a unidimensional thing, right? And so then one of the things that at the same time, I want to also think through what happens if Saidiya's understanding, which I completely accept, what happens if that understanding, or this understanding of slavery that emerges from liberal thought, basically also colonizes the past, right? So we don't actually have to do the work for an understanding of slavery and freedom that precedes this moment, and at the same time to think about how to think about afterlives of slavery, because there's a constant need to do the work of historicizing. And part of the problem for those of us who work in this early modern period is, in fact, that liberalism's conceit is that it doesn't actually, there's no prehistory to liberalism, right? It colonizes the way in which we conceive of the past even before this moment. And so then, therefore, we don't actually have to do the work. We just sort of say, well, there's a slave, right? And that's all we have to then do, as opposed to sort of theorizing the specificity of like what constitutes slavery in the Americas writ large, and then thinking that through concretely, and working through that and theorizing that, right? So we don't even really have, outside of Cuba and Brazil, we don't actually have basic understandings of like where most people were in terms of the structure of the institution. Urban, rural, how big were the estates, right? Which actually is produced, which in the context of the work that she's producing is a kind of a given in a lot of ways in terms of the 19th century, and then she's working from that. But if we don't do the work to do that, right, the sloppiness and the kind of intellectual, the kind of indifference, right, and that's the kind of thing that I think her work points to, is the kind of intellectual indifference and hostility to thinking about slavery as a site of theorization of power. Right? And I think there are a few people in here that I know are grappling with that. I think that in some different ways, I think Alex's work recently on theorizations of power with Agamben and Foucault bring that kind of stuff into relief. I think that there's some, but we haven't done enough of that. And so until we do that work, it becomes impossible for those of us who are theorizing around freedom, who are dealing with these massive numbers of freedom, to actually understand what would be the nature of that freedom before a liberal subject emerges, right? And that requires us to actually think about, in the way that she does, about the state historicizing state and its relationships to power, understanding what the hell would political economy look like before Smith, right? And I think that that's sort of what like Jennifer and Stephanie are trying to grapple with regard to political arithmetic. But that is so few and far in between. But the number boys, right? They're indifferent, right? The white number boys are just like, well, we know what the numbers are. Here's the slave ship. Here's the database, and and you understand what the significance and nature of that is, right? And I think the work that what Saidiya's work is doing is challenging that fundamentally, and yet there's a complete hostility to it as a project because it's footnoted, but not necessarily engaged, fundamentally engaged, right? So when you read and I love these folks' work, but when you read Walter and Ed Baptist and all these other and Sven Beckert and all that other stuff, they can go about business as usual, cite Saidiya, and then move on, right? And what's going on in this room is fundamentally different, right? And I think that's interesting, right? I think it's interesting that scholars of literary theory are actually sort of saying like, look, we can't leave this to the historians, right? And and I think they're right. All right.
Okay, these responses have themselves opened up so many new questions. Before I open it up to the audience, although I want to do that pretty quickly, I'd love to give you all a chance to draw connections that you were thinking of between your talks. If you want to connect the dots a little bit before we throw it open.
One of the things that I really appreciated about your talk, Simone, and a linkage there, and of course to Venus into Act and Lose Your Mother, is the repetition, the ongoing repetition of the erasure in the archive and the sort of ways in which archival violence reinvents itself. I hadn't thought about that for the digital project in this way until this paper. So I feel like it's a connection for sure across the work of Saidiya Hartman.
That issue of erasure of Blackness from a landscape is one that some of us have been thinking about since a smaller symposium that was here a couple of semesters ago, titled in part Afterlives of Slavery. And one of the guests, the poet C.S. Giscombe, talked about a place called Nigger Mountain in Pennsylvania that is also sort of, I think, potentially going to be renamed, or that sort of erasure of Blackness from the landscape is always kind of on the table, and how to think about that in relation to the fact that name also erases a name that mountain had for someone else, before that. The chronologies just unfold in these very obviously non-linear ways that ask us to think in overlapping timelines about these questions.
I think I should go back. You had asked about new scenes of the digital that make the violence barely discernible, or we understand it as barely discernible. Oh, sorry, thank you. And
new barely discernible scenes,
yeah. But for some people, like at the site of, say, an airport, it might be barely discernible for those trusted travelers that just move through and zoom because they give their iris or their fingerprint. But for Black women who's subjected to hair searches in public in a way, so like some people call it a state-sponsored, riffing off Angela Davis, a kind of state-sponsored strip search in that space, or when trans folk go through these body scanners and decisions are made around gender and color-coded in blue and pink. and then be subjected to it's not very discernible. It's discernible. It's tangible, and so they're kind of different rubrics of what gets discerned as violence in a space like the airport with a technology like a biometric technology. And I think then to go back to Jessica Marie Johnston's work about the digital blackness and what it reveals about the archive of slavery, of whose bodies are available for public consumption or for public touching in a space like a city street or a school or an airport. It's the archive that haunts. And I think that shapes the question. Thank you.
Thank you. What questions do we have from the floor? I don't know where the microphone's going to get first, but I see one in the middle and one on the side.
It's me? Okay, great. First of all, thank you all so much. This is such a rich panel, and I want to try to ask a question or that that responds to Simone's question to us, right? Which, if I wrote it down correctly, is what is lost and what can be made possible when Black life is made digital. And so I guess my question emerges out of reflecting on Hazel Carby's talk yesterday, right, which you even evoked in your remarks about the archive in Kew or somewhere, right, and this the labor of the archive, and I wanted to kind of try out a formulation and see if it flies, right, and that would be that in answer to your question, right, the digitization of the archive has de-skilled the socially necessary labor of archival study. Right? And so what is lost is that skill, right? Also that stuff that sticks to the body and you carry through the body scanner, right? But also the kind of underground and renegade and slow archival study, right? Now what is gained though, right? Because you asked what is gained too, is a generalization of the archive beyond history to spaces of literary study, to art, to politics and publicity, and to all this kind of beautiful work that's happening on Black Tumblr, which I don't understand, so I'm glad that you do. So I wonder what you make of that, of this idea of a kind of de-skilling, or also of a kind of transformation of the socially necessary labor of archival study, right? Which is to kind of Herman's point and the anxiety about, we have to take the archive away from the historians, right? Somehow, right? But why, right? What do we gain by, who wants the archive, really, right? Can we connect, I guess we want the archive, I don't know. Can we connect Herman's point about how liberalism erases the scene of its emergence, the violence of the scene of its emergence, to what is happening with the digitization of the archive, which is also erasing the scene of its emergence, right? It is also producing a past image that, again, may erase, are we at risk at losing as well as gaining? So that's the question to the audience.
It's a great question, and I prepped an answer for that had totally nothing to do with what you said. So I'll just more on biometric technology and being failure to enroll. But I guess when I said I like your question or your comment about de-skilling, and when I said it is a security theater that happens in that space, it is quite dismissive of the type of slow work that archivists do, and maybe some of the speed projects that some of us who aren't trained, like I'm talking about myself, do in going to that place. And so when I went to Kew Garden, I was interested in what was about 12 pages before the Book of Negroes, where there were documents about these women who had gone to Francis Tavern to argue for their freedom, and I expected to find much more than I did. And it's about the slow work might have found something else, but it was a fast project, and so I was left with something did stick with me at that moment, and which was its absence. And I think when Herman talked about how to look at liberalism through its exclusions was through these women's self-making at that space, but how could I imagine what I couldn't put words to, what I didn't have the documents to? And I think that's where the tenses and the critical fabulation was the work to be done there, to bring in other stories, to bring in the work of the poet, to bring in what the security guard told me when the archivist didn't have time to talk to me at Francis Tavern about that space. And so there is something perhaps to be gained when the people who whose ancestors shaped that book, like The Rock and Dwayne Johnson from the Book of Negroes, but perhaps not him. Yes, it's true. And perhaps when they can find it accessible, who could not travel to the archive, the same peoples whose houses and homes were raised in Africville, maybe there's a space to access it that way. And so I think it's for a collaborative type of working with those who have the skills to do all that's necessary for that space. So there is something, I think, to be gained, but there's the loss of that slow work, I think. So thank you.
Thank you. This was an amazing panel. I promised myself I wouldn't talk, and here I am talking a lot. I'm sorry. But two things. The one thing is harder for me to talk about. The other thing is easier for some reason. So the first thing I wanted to think about was the whip. I mean, a lot of the stuff about Saidiya's work is about pleasure and pain, and so terror. And I think that one of the things we maybe need to push at theorizing, right, is the pleasure part, especially some of the recent work that's been done by, say, Ariana Cruz about Black women, BDSM, and the whip, right, to think about a kind of performance of this pain that is a reclaiming of agency in complicated ways. So I wanted to also think about that. But then the other thing that's harder for me to talk about is a thing that's actually kept me up last night and it's frustrating me. And it, Professor Bennett, it's really related to what you're saying, and that's this idea of kind of doing the necessary work, right, about slavery. We've consistently been talking about transatlantic slavery over and over, and one of the things that I think has dropped out because we talk about transatlantic slavery is the entire African continent. So not just, we talk about temporizing the different tenses of freedom, but we don't talk about slavery and the slave trade that happened within Africa. We don't talk about slaves that were brought to Africa, ships that were moved from Angola to Southern Africa. We haven't mentioned that, and I think what happens, the reason is because it's a different model of slavery, it's a different language of slavery, and it also complicates our understanding of Blackness. Right, transatlantic slavery, I think, keeps intact certain notions of Blackness, whereas I think if we think about African slavery, the moves of slaves from Madagascar, from different parts of the world to Southern Africa, for example, to Angola, it changes necessarily and forces us to historicize some of the stuff that we haven't been doing. And I think this idea is what points to this, but I don't think we've been having this kind of conversation about how our model of transatlantic slavery needs to be actually, it shouldn't just be slavery, it should be transatlantic slavery, and it's very specific. There were people that were moved all over. That's my rant, I'm sorry.
You guys want to take that?
First.
Yeah. But I think that yes. But at the same time, just think about, I want to take the first part of what you were just saying, like even think about that question of agency. How do we even conceptualize frameworks for thinking about, here's a session on tenses of freedom. We have an enormous free Black population in the Americas, and how do we sort of frame, these experiences? How do we write those histories? How do we even conceptualize those histories that don't privilege liberal implotment, right? And just if that were just the starting point, then how does one do that with regard to the story of slavery? Because on the other hand, I think that what Saidiya's work does for me is, rather than sort of saying, let's just add, we need to have this, and that, and keep adding to it, because that also produces a kind of progressive teleology that somehow one day, if we all sort of work on it, we'll have a complete understanding and we'll therefore know what the existence is. But that won't answer the question of, like, what's the meaning of this here freedom, right? And I think that, so I think obviously a lot of folks are working on slavery. It's a question of how we're thinking about these kinds of questions, right? And I think that part of it is that, Saidiya was the one who, I think one of the first persons who reminded me of this years ago. It's like someone like Du Bois, right? Who wrote Black Reconstruction. There was never a kind of acknowledgement of that work, right? And once it was finally, and I think that is not a small thing, right? That we're actually only at the beginning of these kinds of questions. So even though there's all this work being done on slavery and freedom, the kind of theorization that this book is asking us to do, right? The kind of hard lifting and thinking, right? The kind of acquiring the kinds of tools to do the kind of critical theory that this is asking us to do. I'm not sure we're really fully there yet, right? And so then keep adding a kind of empirical study. This, I spend my time in Mozambique trying to figure out Mozambique, South Africa recently, blah blah blah. But the point there is, it's not just simply saying what is slavery, right? Because that already is a liberal project that sort of is the English story that is like sort of saying, well, what happened there is, African despotism, right? And we sort of ended this, and there are ways in which we haven't even moved outside of the very framing that constitutes the university that creates both the curriculum and knowledge production. So all of these categories that we're using are inherited abolitionist categories, right? The very university is an abolitionist project that's connected to a national project and a liberal project, and we're actually embedded in it, right? And so how do we get out of that? That's what I think that this work is asking me to do. It's like to sort of say, this work that we are part of actually forces us to challenge the very categories that we have to rely on. And therefore, how do we produce meanings and understandings from there, right? That sort of transcend the very kind of limitations of the categorizations that are produced by liberalism. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up question that builds on Harshini's question, and it's also about thinking about lineages of state formation and kind of critical traditions that don't naturalize the liberal state formation. And I guess this is a question for Herman, and it's also a question for Sarah. And so I guess, Herman, I have these questions about, the lineages of the absolute state, Mesu's anthropology of slavery, which I would say is not assuming that liberal state, Mbembe's work on African state formations, and if that doesn't in some ways kind of like radically shift an imagination of what freedom is, and so not simply just a kind of a critique of liberalism, but a political imagination when citizenship is in no way even the horizon of what our language of possibility is. So it seems that there has been this work, and just thinking about that work and what it enables for us, or how we actually, kind of think about these notions of kind of a freedom, or being on the planet that are not tethered to a particular kind of political vocabulary. And for me, thinking about the African example, we think about the violence of like the imposition of the state as a kind of formation of social life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this. Yes, and the thing is, that's exactly right. So like while I'm working in an archive constantly, the last few years, just sort of, like following up, doing what you did, right? With Lose Your Mother, like spending an enormous amount of time in spaces that are both structured, that are at the structure of the conjuncture of liberalism, but also outside of it, right? And you see these spaces like in like urban, and like within the context of urban Africa and urban Latin America, right? There are ways in which those things are pushing up against, but also then exceed the very possibilities, and yet at the same time, it's. How does one then put that to practice, right? How does one actually write and conceptualize that work into the kind of thing that we're trying to make sense of in contemporary life, right? Because at the end of the day, there are certain kinds of boxes in which where does that fit, right? Does that become the travel writing? Does that become, how does one conceptualize? And within the context of the academy, there are limits to that, right? And so I agree with you completely. I don't really know. I don't really know how it's interesting, say like Mbembe's work, how that's being read and where it's being read, right? And to what use it's being put, right? Similarly, and I appreciate like Jared's criticism of the work and engagement with it, right? But I also think that there's a way in which that stuff there's so much more out there that's even outside of that exceeds even his vision. Yeah, no, exactly. It's Fred right behind you.
Yeah, this is great. I appreciate all these presentations and Evie's response so much, and the questions too. I guess, and I think maybe this question has already been asked, and that's just my own way of clarifying it because I'm slow with these things. But I guess it has to do with the nature of the archive itself. It seems to me that implicit and explicit in all the presentations and in the other work that y'all have done is a kind of broadening out to the point of an airy thinness, the notion of archive. And I'm actually thinking about this now too in relation to something that Professor Carby was doing, yesterday in terms of thinking about the archive as a climate controlled space. The fragility of what's left in the archive, and then what happens in the aftermath of a kind of atmospheric change in which that fragility is actually enacted. And it brings me back to Christina Shaw. In other words, maybe the question would be, what's the relationship between the archive and climate, or archive and weather, right? Is there a kind of, are we in the same sense in which we are walking around in this climate, right? Are we also walking around in the archive? And to the extent that we recognize that we are walking around in the archive, does that would that recognition open up some possibilities for retheorization along the lines that you were describing, Herman, but that y'all were also all in enacting?
You guys want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I'll just say I think that's really profound and helpful in thinking about the archive and climate, because we know that the archive is wielded as a disciplinary weapon, is weaponized, right, as a tool of anti-Blackness. And in some ways that is so pervasive that it is as climate. It's scholarly climate in some ways, and which makes the work of so many people in this room. And I think about the expansion of our considerations of the archive that Professor Morgan has done in her work, and it makes it so powerful. It gives us a terrain upon which to contest that anti-Blackness, in terms of what constitutes a source for thinking about the knowledge production of the character of slavery and Blackness. And so I think it's really a helpful articulation to think about the active project of doing that work in a kind of intellectual project. And I that's of course what Venus in Two Acts in many ways gives us, and also what Hazel's talk provided.
But I also think it gets weaponized in different ways as who can have access, who can read it, who can or does not practice narrative restraint, as we've been warned. And so, just as an aside, I was in the archive preparing for this. I had to find something, and so this was on Wednesday, and this is about speed. And so I was looking at these ledgers, plantation ledgers from Texas. The document that I wanted was actually out on display. There was some marginalia in it. It was the Affleck book on plantation management, but someone had written the marginalia about how to manage pregnant enslaved women. But what I was left, that was gone. What I was left with was a daily record of cotton picking. And there were columns that were missing, that were absented. But in those columns would be no picking today because it rained. And so the weather was in that climate control archive. And I mean, that's all I had to say.
That's excellent. Thanks for quick.
Good afternoon or good morning, I guess. Did I interrupt somebody else on the other side?
No, it's all good.
Okay.
2-hour lunches. So we're like, well, how much are we gonna eat?
So I'm thinking about some of Adrienne Davis's work, and she's going to be on the next panel. In relation to what you said, Dr. Haley, about insurgency, and in relation to what you said, Dr. Brown, about surveillance. So I'm thinking about the relationship between sort of working speculatively and thinking about the interiority of subjects who are not represented in historical documents, how that relates to how we conceptualize insurgent or fugitive space contemporarily, but then also on the flip side, how does that contribute to surveillance in a certain way? Like, is there something to being unknowable or unseeable in a historical document? Is there some sort of privacy that we owe historical subjects that were unknown or forgotten in a particular way? And I think positioned as academics with political engagements, we want to excavate and recover. But I'm just thinking about my own thesis defense, which was last year, and I think about it all the time. But there was Dr. Fuentes was on my committee, and so was Dr. Cooper. But I think about some of the questions that I got because I just think about rereading like liberal subjecthood or my particular contemporary idea of interiority or autonomy, because I kind of stay away from the word agency, onto historical subjects for whom these contemporary paradigms didn't exist or weren't salient.
I have a short answer, and it came from Hazel Carby's talk yesterday about what happens when perhaps, or the desire and the hope maybe that certain people within those archives could have privacy, could be resist capture by the archivist. And if I go back to that Book of Negroes and the move from it to being digital, that the remarks section, which were short, they were harsh, they were written by the British, did not even contend with their entire humanity or their access, the people who were written about, their access and their ways in which they moved to get to this other space, which was said to be freedom in Canada, is contingent. That maybe without all those details, maybe their privacy can be what we held intact, or a different type of way of understanding them could be made beside these harsh shorthand narrations of their lives. And so maybe there's something about resisting capture in these spaces.
Thank you. That is such a really important set of questions. There were so much in there and so rich. So I appreciate it. I've been thinking about them for a while. And I guess just my initial quick response as well is, thinking about the law as alchemical and a fabrication in and of itself. So I think the focus has been on sort of what kinds of speculative modes historians have turned to, and what are the ethics of those modes. And I think that's crucial, but I think equally crucial is to recognize the structures of fabrication that undergird the documents that we turn to in which there is representation. So to think just, dialectically about unknowability, which is really crucial and which is a hard thing, I think, to think about as in narration. It's a hard thing to consider as an ethical practice for historians. I think you're really right about that. And to think alongside Patricia Williams is really important to me in considering legal alchemies and the fabrication of stories and constructed knowledge as the regime of the law, as the very doctrine of law. And so to try and weigh those, I feel like it's a weighing process in sort of trying to write and theorize one's historicizing practice.
So thank you for just this rich session and just the rich yesterday and today and just everything you all have said. I've been like kind of writing furiously and screaming while I'm writing, just in excitement for all of what you're saying. I sort of want to, I think, circle back to something that's already, I think, been coming up, but I want to put another term on the table that I think has been like lingering in the room yesterday, I think in this session as well. And I want to attach it to something that I think it was, I think Sarah might have said this. You said the evidence of things not written at one point, which of course should invoke and echo a biblical passage, evidence of things not seen. And then I think for me, it begged the question, well, then what kind of evidence is that which is not written? And what kind of evidence is that which is not seen? And maybe it's the evidence of something felt. And so it just got me thinking about then stuff like the sacred. Because I think the kind of, and I think that's connected to the archive as well, how we approach the archive. And so I'm wondering just, again, if our relationship to the archive is like possibly a counter fabrication, trying to fabricate against the way in which the archive itself has been fabricated as a scene of violence. I'm thinking about, of course, scenes of subjection. Then it makes me wonder then about the kind of work that we're involved in Black study, and even the kind of work that I'm just hearing constantly performed here, not just at the front of the room, but even in the Q&A and everything that's happening here, that there's a counter climate perhaps that we're involved in, which itself is a practicing of another kind of archival practice that we're engaged in right now. And that seems to me to be hovering around the felt and the attempt to articulate the felt at the scene of a kind of violent fabrication itself, a kind of counter fabrication. All of that is now, again, conjuring for me. And I think conjure is the word too. We're doing a conjure work. And I think that, I wonder if we might be able to put on the table that kind of vocabulary and see what kind of traction it could give us, especially given, and Herman, you know this from your work, especially given that arguably much of what we're contending with around the archive has been a kind of theological brutality. And so it seems to me Black study is moving against that theological brutality with its own kind of practice of field practice. And so sacred is the word. Jackie Alexander and a whole host of Black feminist thinkers have thought about this, and I wonder what happens if we bring that back now into play, but as a kind of counterfabulation of the sort that Scenes invites us into and is the practice of, and arguably we're practicing right now.
I'm totally on that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we're implicated in it in some really interesting ways, because there's always already a way in which the work of Black studies in some ways is a secular project, right? And that in some ways is in tension with the very thing that you're actually saying. And so that the archive itself, right, the written archive that we're dealing with, that you're and even at epistemological level, is fundamentally conceived through secular terms alongside the liberal, right? And what you're actually then speaking to is in fact a way of felt, which I think that is actually in some of these things it produces a different kind of understanding of the question of freedom, right? Understanding the question of slavery and understanding of questions of like what we might even identify as like cultural formation, right? And it becomes really hard to sort of point to that, to materialize it, to actually engage it, because the question yesterday, folks kept talking about evidence, right? Well, what would the evidence of that be? Right, and I know there are a few folks who have sort of grappled with that in some ways. Like sort of Stéphane Pommier when he's dealing with the the ghost, sort of the spectral presence of the ghost, and the ways in which that sort of makes its way into both the landscape and the the landscape and understanding of the Cuban past, right? But a lot of us and our projects themselves are by very definition hostile to even those notions of the felt, right? So while we can actually believe in one sense, we don't actually sort of think that should be part of what the work that we are doing, right? Because there's the way in which the work that we do oftentimes is a threat in some other kinds of ways, and so that we're always bound by the security of the notion of the archive, right? So we can prove it, that we can substantiate it, so that we can inhabit a certain kind of professionalism, a certain kind of institutional demands of what the academy is. I agree completely, and I think that's where some of this work really might need to go, and some of us actually have to learn that grammar, right? And I think it also is it is a challenge. It's a challenge that comes from that also then reverberates back onto sort of Saidiya's work, and as the way that both in here, but really in like Lose Your Mother, among other things.
Although isn't the caution in Lose Your Mother against letting the felt take us where knowledge can't go? In other words, I am agreeing, and I think that is the term that needs to come in. But there, I read Lose Your Mother as offering a caution on just a reversal of those terms.
And I think scenes is a caution against empathy, and yet I think with the contradiction is that there is so much felt. Right, and so I think it's one of the things I've always been scared about in reading scenes is just the pitfalls of empathy and sentimentality, and yet at the same time the weight of the feeling produced by all of the work that I think it's a tension.
Mm-hmm. Do we? Okay, we've got 2 more questions, I think, and then we will break for lunch.
Hi, I am thinking about the Black Muslim body in relation to surveillance and also in relation to the way, we see a lot of scholarship around the racialization of the brown body, and it's being framed as the terrorist image and that kind of thing. But I'm also wondering what we might learn about the ways in which historically the presence of Black Muslims, I think there's research coming out that shows 15 to 25% of the original slaves identified as Muslim. And also I guess dipping into the conversation about erasure and archival erasure, is there anything to be gained from sort of being intentional about the presence of the Black Muslim body, and how might this conversation, or how might this figure sorry.
Maybe, do you want to go ahead and ask your question as well?
This is in a different direction, but now I'm with your question. Thank you also for the panel. And my question is sparked by something that Herman said, but maybe it's also more broadly about the tenses of Blackness. I think and work a lot about contemporary California, which of course is also colonial Mexico, right? And about this gap between I and estuvieron, right? What is that endurance that stretches between there was and there is now? And kind of the non-event of emancipation. And then you seemed like you were kind of gesturing also towards a non-event of slavery, and maybe also the non-event of the Louisiana Purchase. Like, what happens when we kind of take a step back from these, red letter dates and think about kind of endurance as something that doesn't necessarily start or end, or thinking about the relation, kind of what are the tenses of Blackness on that land, and how does that push on or help us think about the relation between Blackness, indigeneity, and temporality?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I mean, it troubles it, right? I mean, clearly it has to trouble it because I think that in some ways that this framework of the non-event actually is in fact what the kind of work that where I'm gesturing towards exactly, and that's drawing on scenes of subjection. It's like it's there, but it's also trio among others, right? And I think that what it does is that it gets us out of these sort of in some ways it gets us out of the kind of teleology of triumphalist histories, right? Obviously. But then what it does is it also then requires us to sort of attend to the way that scenes, like her discussion of community, like all the categories in there. I mean, she's both, there's a way in which there's no Black community that emerges out of this, right? Out of this project. And I think that that's what a non-event approach to the study of slavery then does, right? That these things are produced both, they're individuated, but they're also produced in a kind of like micro dimension, right? That requires a kind of, that then sort of allows for a complicated understanding of Blackness that might be implicated with whiteness and simultaneously with indigeneity, right? And then we have to think more carefully with regard to like territoriality, right? And questions of not so much of sovereignty, autonomy, but questions of territoriality in relationship to sovereignty, right? And what that might mean in terms of how people might constitute at a certain moment themselves in some kind of complicated way that is both within and outside of the framework of the existent state that is operative, or the political rationale that's operative. Now, so I totally buy that, and I guess what I would also say is that I think that the work on Muslims and Black Muslims and slavery, I think that the work there, I think that sort of the new starting point is Butch Ware's work, right? I mean, just fundamentally sort of a kind of pushing us back to sort of thinking about, and it brings us back to the question of Africa, right? And sort of understanding that much of the fabulation around Africa much of the fabulation around the Middle East and Africa is actually produced by a certain kind of 19th century telos that sort of says, this is, that which is Black African and Muslim is in fact primitive, when in fact what people like Butch Ware and others are doing are talking about the degrees of continuity, and that are sort of produced mnemonically and through a sort of deep kind of fundamental cultural memory that in fact is more of a question of continuity as opposed to being rerouted by a 19th century national liberal project where Middle Eastern Muslims, in order to feel good in relationship to other projects, have to disavow the kind of historicity, the deep history and historicity of Black Islam, right? And that might actually require us to sort of think more carefully what goes on in the context of the Americas, right? In terms of the question of like cultural production, and the question of and the question of slavery.
And for your question, your name is again? Najat. I guess I think of that quite recently in a different temporal location. This is through Black Muslim surveillance and the FBI. And there's a film called, I think it's Malik and Nas, or Nas and Malik. I often mix it. No. Yeah. Yes. And the ways in which their two characters, Black, male, gay, move around the city loving on each other in public but in private ways, puts them under the surveillance of the FBI. And as we know, outside of that fictional world, the FBI has been, running these kinds of terrorist starter kits with people, where they, like life coaching basically, where they entrap young Muslim people. They infiltrate mosques and families, and not families, but there was even an FBI agent that became a bridesmaid at a wedding. And so Yes, and so I think that is. I try not to make those links, those jump from slavery to, say, contemporary FBI surveillance, but it is important to look at the FBI's history of surveilling Black Muslim people from Malcolm X to the Nation of Islam, to look for sites of resistance and ways in which people have challenged the FBI's continued practices of surveillance, particularly when just this week, there was a recent document that was released around this new term that they've come up with, which is like Black identity extremist as a site for surveillance. And so that is probably not going to give you the answers that you need, but I would love to do.
I'm just wondering.
20 years ago, we were reading Scenes of Subjection. Today, we are reading Scenes of Subjection. 20 years from now, I think we will be reading Scenes of Subjection. Please help me thank my co-panelists or the panelists.
Hey, excellent job, you guys. Really great. Very, very well. All right. You guys are great. Thank you. Yes, smart as hell.
You guys, oh my gosh, so brilliant. So, I knew that was coming from you because I've seen you work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Behind something there?
He's alive. I felt out of my league with all y'all historians.
I'm not a historian.
Gold star. Everyone came with such fire.
There were great overlap.
Yeah. And yet geographically, the whole North American continent.